The snow had been falling for 2 days straight when I found her on the highway. I almost didn't stop. It was past 9 at night. The road between Sundridge and Huntsville was black ice from one end to the other, and my wipers were barely keeping up with the sleet. But there she was, a shape on the shoulder, just past the kilometre marker, curled against the guardrail like she'd tried to make herself small enough to disappear into it. I pulled over before I'd even made the decision. She was wearing a thin cardigan, in February, in Ontario. I got out and crouched down beside her, and she turned her face toward me, and I knew her immediately, even in the dark, even through the swelling around her eye. It was my daughter-in-law, my son's wife of 4 years, the woman I had spent the last 6 months being warned about by my own sister, who had filled my ear with so many small poisonous things that I had started to keep my distance from her without ever asking myself why. I pulled off my coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, and she grabbed my arm and said very quietly, the way a person speaks when they've run out of strength for anything louder. He knew. He knew what she was doing, and he let it happen. She wasn't talking about my son. She was talking about my brother-in-law. I need to tell you about my family first, or none of what comes next will make sense. I'm 63 years old. I live in a farmhouse outside of Sundridge, which is a small town in Parry Sound District, about 2.5 hours north of Toronto. I've lived in this house for 31 years. My husband, rest his soul, bought it the year we got married and spent 2 decades slowly fixing everything that was wrong with it, which was considerable. He passed 8 years ago, cardiac event, no warning, gone before the ambulance reached the end of our road. And I kept the house because I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. I have one son. He's 34. He works as a site supervisor for a construction company out of North Bay, and he's good at it. Careful and fair, the kind of man who remembers every subcontractor's kid's name and shows up early. He met his wife at a fundraising dinner for the Huntsville Hospital Foundation about 5 years ago. She was there with her employer, a small accounting firm that had donated a table. He called me the next morning to tell me about her, which he had never done before, not once in 34 years, so I paid attention. They got married 18 months later at a conservation area outside of town. It was October. The maples were extraordinary, and she laughed during their vows because my son stumbled over his words, and she told him afterward that that was the exact moment she knew she'd made the right choice. I remember standing there watching them and feeling something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. My sister is 4 years younger than me. She and her husband settled in Barrie after he retired from the provincial government, and she has opinions about everything. My house, my cooking, my driving, my finances, my relationships, delivered always in that particular tone that manages to sound like concern while functioning as control. I love her. I also know exactly what she is. I learned it so slowly over so many decades that I'd stopped being able to see it clearly. Her husband is the brother-in-law I mentioned. He and my son's wife knew each other before she ever met my son. He had been a client of her firm for a short time. Nothing significant, routine tax work, but he'd left under circumstances that were apparently uncomfortable, though I didn't know any of this at the time. My sister told me he'd left because he found the billing excessive. He told me he found the firm not particularly professional. Neither of them mentioned that there had been a formal complaint filed with the accounting regulatory body, or that the complaint had been dismissed, or that my brother-in-law had written a letter to her supervisor that her supervisor had shown her, or any of the rest of it. I didn't know any of that until much later. What I knew was that after my son announced his engagement, my sister started calling me more frequently. Small things at first. Did I know that my daughter-in-law had worked at 3 different firms in 6 years? Did I know she had a cousin who'd had trouble with the law? Did I know her family was from out of province, Nova Scotia, and that they weren't particularly close? Each call dropped one more small stone into the water. I am ashamed to say I let them accumulate. The first year of their marriage was fine, as far as I could see. They came up for Thanksgiving and Christmas. My daughter-in-law helped in the kitchen without being asked, and remembered that I take my coffee with just a bit of cream and no sugar, which sounds like a small thing but isn't. She brought me a jar of dulse from a trip back to visit her family in Cape Breton. She sent me a card on my birthday with a handwritten note inside, not just a signature, an actual note about what she hoped the year would bring me. My sister, during this period, continued to call. She told me my daughter-in-law had been rude at a dinner in Barrie that I hadn't attended. She told me my son had mentioned to her husband that they were having some disagreements. Though when I asked my son about this directly, he looked puzzled and said they'd had one argument about whether to adopt a dog, which they'd resolved by adopting a cat instead. She told me my daughter-in-law had made a comment about my sister's home that she'd found offensive, though she couldn't quite recall exactly what the comment had been. I should have heard the shape of what was happening. I didn't. By the second year, I noticed I was seeing my daughter-in-law less. They still came at Christmas, but Thanksgiving was now in Barrie at my sister's. My son explained that it was easier with his work schedule to do one trip instead of two. That made sense. I accepted it. I told myself it was natural, that families shifted around, that I shouldn't read into it. What I didn't know then was that my brother-in-law had told my son, at some point during that year, that his wife had made a serious billing error at the firm before she left her previous position, a claim that was entirely fabricated, and that if the story got out, it could damage both her reputation and, by association, my son's standing in the community. He'd said it quietly, privately, framed as concern. He'd said he just wanted my son to be aware. My son, who trusted his uncle the way I had trusted my sister, was rattled. He didn't tell his wife what had been said. He told me later that he thought he was protecting her. I understand the impulse, even though it was the wrong choice. He started to pull back from her slightly, that particular kind of distance that a person creates when they're worried and don't know how to say why. She felt it and didn't know what she'd done. She started to try harder. He misread her trying harder as pressure. The space between them widened. My sister told me she was hearing he was not particularly happy. In October of that year, my daughter-in-law lost a pregnancy at 11 weeks. I found out from my son in a brief phone call. He sounded exhausted, and I asked if she was all right, and he said she was managing. I asked if I should come down, and he said she probably wanted some space. I asked if he wanted me to call her, and he said she'd reach out when she was ready. She never reached out because, I learned much later, he hadn't told her I'd offered. I sent a card. I'm not sure it arrived. I didn't follow up, and I am not proud of that. I was operating at that point under the belief, carefully constructed by my sister's calls, that my daughter-in-law found me a bit much and preferred limited contact. I have no idea where this notion came from. My sister had introduced it so gradually that I couldn't locate the moment it had taken hold. By the following spring, my daughter-in-law had left the accounting firm and started doing freelance bookkeeping from home. My son told me this was her choice. She told me later it was partly her choice, and partly that the environment had become untenable after a reference check for a new position revealed that someone, she never found out who, had contacted her former colleague and repeated the fabricated billing story. She couldn't prove anything. She just started over. She was doing that a lot by then. Starting over, quietly, without complaint, because complaining had started to feel like a risk she couldn't afford in a marriage where she couldn't identify the source of what was wrong. I think about that now, and I have to put it out of my mind or I can't continue. The February, my son was sent up north for a job site issue. Something structural that needed his direct oversight, 3 weeks minimum, possibly more. My daughter-in-law was alone in their house in North Bay. My sister and her husband drove up to visit her. They told my son they were checking in on her, that it was the right thing to do, that he shouldn't worry. He was relieved. He trusted them. She told me later that the visit lasted 4 days and felt like an occupation. My brother-in-law went through her filing cabinet while she was in the shower. She found the drawer slightly misaligned when she came out and didn't say anything because she didn't know what she was dealing with yet. My sister told her, over dinner the first night, that my son had confided he was thinking about a separation. This was a lie. She told her that he'd mentioned concerns about her financial management. Also a lie. She told her that the family had been worried for some time, and that perhaps it would be best if she took some time to visit her own family in Cape Breton while my son sorted his thoughts. My daughter-in-law said she needed to speak with my son directly. My sister said, of course, that was perfectly reasonable, and then spent the rest of the visit finding small ways to prevent it from happening. A phone that kept experiencing bad reception. A conversation that always started up at the exact moment she reached for her cell, a suggestion one evening that she looked unwell and should lie down. On the 4th day, my daughter-in-law packed a bag and told them she was going to drive south to a friend's house in Huntsville. She needed space to think. They said that sounded sensible. I don't know exactly what happened on that road. She was never fully able to tell me, and I never pressed her. What I know is that her car went off the highway on the stretch between Magnetawan and Sundridge. She wasn't unconscious, but she was in shock, and her phone had no signal, and it was February in Ontario, and she had been sitting against that guardrail long enough that when I found her she couldn't fully feel her hands. I wrapped her in my coat. I got her into my car, and she told me, in pieces during the 40-minute drive back to my house with the heat blasting, and the snow still coming down, everything. I called my son first. He answered on the second ring, and I told him his wife was at my house, and she was safe, and he needed to come home immediately. He said he couldn't leave the job site. I said he could and he would, and that I was not asking. There was a pause, and something in my voice must have reached him across the 300 kilometers, because he said he'd be there by morning. Then I called my best friend. She is 71 years old and worked for 40 years as a family law paralegal out of Parry Sound, and she has forgotten more about documentation and procedure than most people ever learn. I told her what my daughter-in-law had told me, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Write everything down tonight, while it's fresh, and don't let her sign anything." I wrote everything down. My daughter-in-law sat at my kitchen table with her hands around a mug of chamomile tea and told me the story from the beginning, not just the 4 days in North Bay, but the 2 years before it. And I wrote it all down in my notebook with the blue cover that I use for household accounts. And when she got to the part about the fabricated billing story and my son pulling away from her without telling her why, I had to put the pen down for a moment. I had heard things. I had let things settle. I had kept my distance when I should have picked up the phone. "I thought you didn't want to hear from me," she said. She wasn't angry when she said it. That was the worst part. She'd had 2 years to make peace with it. I said, "I'm sorry. I should have called." She nodded. She didn't say it was fine because it wasn't. I respected her for that. My son arrived at 6:47 in the morning. He looked the way his father used to look after a bad night, hollowed out, the skin under his eyes dark, that particular set to his jaw that meant he'd been driving and thinking too hard the whole way. He came in the door and his wife was standing in the kitchen, and he stopped and looked at her like he was recalibrating something fundamental, and then he crossed the room and held on to her for a long time without speaking. I left them alone and went to sit in the living room with my coffee. My best friend arrived at 9. She brought her reading glasses and a legal pad and the quiet authority of a woman who had spent decades in rooms where things needed to be dealt with. She sat down with my daughter-in-law and helped her document what had occurred during those 4 days in a clear and organized way, not as a complaint or an accusation, just a precise account of events, dated, in order, with specific details. What was said, who was present, what the context was. My daughter-in-law remembered everything. She had the kind of memory that sharpens under pressure rather than blurring, which I imagine had been both a gift and a burden over the past 2 years. My son sat at the kitchen table and read the account when it was finished. He read it twice. Then he put it down and looked at the window for a while and said, "I didn't ask enough questions, I just believed them." Nobody told him it was fine either. My sister called me 3 days after the accident. She didn't mention the accident. She called to tell me that my daughter-in-law had left suddenly from North Bay in a concerning way, and that she and her husband were worried, and that perhaps I might want to speak to my son about whether the marriage was sustainable. I let her finish. Then I said, "She's here. She's been here since Monday. She told me everything." The silence on the other end of the line had a particular quality to it. Not surprised exactly, but recalculating. I said, "I want you to understand that I know what you told her about the separation. I know about the filing cabinet. I know about the phone. I know about the billing story you've been using since before they were even married. And I need you to know that I am done being the person who listened to you and didn't ask questions." She said I was misunderstanding the situation. I said I didn't think I was. She said my daughter-in-law had clearly upset me and I wasn't being rational. I said, "We're not going to do this. What I'm going to tell you is what happens next. My daughter-in-law is consulting with a lawyer about what occurred in North Bay. My son is aware of everything. If either of you contacts them directly before they've had a chance to decide how they'd like to proceed, I will support whatever decision they make, including a formal complaint." Another silence. "And the Christmas arrangement," I added, "is finished." She started to cry. I recognized the particular quality of those tears. I'd been hearing them for 59 years. And I said very gently, I love you, but I'm not going to do this anymore. I hung up. I sat in my kitchen for a long time afterward. The snow was finally done. The light on the fields outside was white and clean and very still. My daughter-in-law did consult a lawyer. The lawyer explained that what had occurred in North Bay, the deception about my son's intentions, the interference with her ability to communicate with her spouse, the potential tampering with her personal documents, occupied a serious area, though proving specific intent was complex. She decided not to pursue formal action. That was her choice, made carefully and without pressure from anyone. My son and my best friend and I all told her we would support her whatever she decided. What she did do was contact the accounting regulatory body herself, explain that a complaint had been made some years earlier against her and subsequently dismissed, and ask whether there was any record of who had initiated that complaint. There was. My brother-in-law had filed it under a slightly different name variant than he used with family, his full given name rather than the shortened version. She had not known this before. She knew it now. She shared this information with her former employer, not as a formal complaint, but as context. Her former employer found it clarifying. She is now running her own bookkeeping practice from home. She has 11 clients, and she added 3 more this past fall. She's building something solid, on her own terms, and it's working. My son has done the work of understanding what he did during those 2 years. The questions he didn't ask, the conversations he didn't initiate, the protection he thought he was offering that was actually a wall he was building. He's in counseling. He goes every week. He doesn't make a show of it, which I find more encouraging than if he did. The last time I saw them together, they were sitting on my porch in the late afternoon, and he was listening to her. Really listening, the kind that involves your whole body, and she was laughing at something, and it was enough. My sister and I speak occasionally. Less than before. The last time I saw her in person was at a family gathering last September, and we were polite to each other in the way of people who know they can't repair something but have decided not to worsen it either. Her husband stayed at the far end of the room. He and I have not spoken directly since the phone call. I don't know that I want that to change. I think about that night often, the shape of her in the headlights, the way I almost kept driving. I've lived long enough to know that most of the worst things don't arrive as catastrophes, they arrive as adjustments. A slight tilt, so small you don't notice it while it's happening, and then you look up one day and you're somewhere you never intended to be, having done things you never intended to do, because you kept choosing the easy path of believing what was placed in front of you. I was 62 years old that February, and I still had to learn that lesson. I'm glad I stopped. I pulled over because something in me, some instinct older than my own reasoning, said stop, and I've thought about what would have happened if I hadn't, and I can't stay with the thought for long. She came for Easter this year. She drove herself up from North Bay, arrived before my son did, because he got stuck behind a slowdown on the 400. She came in through the back door the way she always does and put a bag of dulse on the counter, Cape Breton, the good stuff, from the same place as that first jar, and she said, I made lemon squares, they're in the car. I'll get them in a minute. I said, let me put the kettle on. She sat down at my kitchen table and the afternoon light came in through the window over the sink the way it does in April, when the angle is finally right after all those winter months, and I thought, this is what it was supposed to look like. This is what we almost lost. The kettle started to sing, and I got up to make the tea, and outside the maples were just beginning to bud, that first uncertain green that never gets old, no matter how many times you've seen it. 63 springs, and it still catches in my throat. Some things are worth stopping for. I know that now better than I've ever known anything.